Oh hey guys, welcome back to Cool Bike Projects. On this episode, we're getting ready to restore this old Cannondale CAD2 mountain bike frame. And this one's a little bit tricky. So I thought it'd be good to do an episode where we talk about sourcing the parts for an old or odd size mountain bike frame and coming up with kind of a step-by-step process of deciding what you actually will need for the bike as well as a budget for it. So thanks for joining us for this special episode. Right, so first things first. Let's say you found your dream frame. Maybe it's something from when you were back in high school and you thought, man, this is the bike I always wanted to build up. So you start collecting some old parts and bits and pieces and say, you know what? I think I got enough to build this bike. But before you know it, you run into your first snag. Maybe it's the derailleur hanger, maybe it's the bottom bracket spacing, could be the headset, whatever it is. But probably the biggest frustration I had years ago is when people would come into the bike shop and would say, I just need this one little part, and then I have to tell them, sorry, they don't make it anymore, or I have nowhere to find it. Luckily, the internet has made things a lot easier to find, and by and large, you can find a lot of new parts on Amazon, eBay, wherever. But still, it's nice to know before you start on a project, especially something big like a repaint, that you have everything you need and it's going to fit within your budget. So let's talk frames for a second. This old CAD2 frame is not bad from 50 feet away, but it certainly has its share of scratches, dents, and dings. It has a standard bottom bracket. This is a 68 millimeter shell, and by and large, looks like we should be able to find something for a triple triangle in the front, or even if we wanted to convert this to a single speed, this won't be a problem for us. But before we get too excited, something interesting about this is that this frame used a very special adapter. And the reason why this bike frame's been sitting on the wall for 3 months is it took me that long to source the number 16 Wheelsmith dropout hanger for this bike frame. So something else to consider as you're working on a bike is not just the parts you need to go on the bike, but what on the frame could cause you major problems. Head tube angle is something I get asked about a lot. And people that have a mid-90s bike who never came with where the bike never came with a suspension fork want to know, hey, can I put this fork on there? So let's say you talk to your buddy and he has an old RockShox or an old Manitou and he says, dude, this would work perfect for your bike. Something that's important to do is before you get too excited, you actually want to get parts together and put a fork on the frame to see what the angle is going to look like. People ask me all the time, can I run an 80 millimeter fork? Can I run a 100 millimeter fork? And the bottom line is, I don't know the geometry of all the frames. So it's wise to at least put a set of wheels and a fork and a set of bars on there to see, is it actually going to work? So let's do a little bit of that, and then we'll talk about some of the parts we're going to use for this bike build and see what's going to work. Okay, first things first, we're going to cheat a little bit. I already have a wheel set that I know is going to work on here. This has got a 8 or 9 speed cassette free hub on it. We'll talk about gearing in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and put a front and back wheel on this as well as the fork. So what I've got right now is a stem and the fork, but I'm not going to bother putting bearings or the headset all together. We're just going to put this up in there and pinch it sort of tight, just so we can get an idea of the angle. If you notice on this bike frame, I got a bunch of mass sticking out of the steer tube, and that's a good thing. A lot of bike frames back in the day came with very short head tubes, and so if you go to buy a used fork, it's very common to see something that has just 7.5, maybe 8 inches in length. And I got lucky here where this is actually 9 inches. So again, it's easy to find a used fork, but on older bike frames, it was common to have the steer tubes cut really short with just enough space for one spacer and the stem. So if this does work for you on one of your future projects, you want to make sure you have a long enough steer tube that it clears through the top of the top tube and gives you enough space to have spacers and a new stem. Next is our wheel set here. Now this doesn't have to be perfect for now. We're just trying to get these to sit between the frame and the fork and then be able to put it on the ground so we can see how does this angle look. And what's a little tricky is that a steep head tube angle can work to your benefit or to your detriment on a frame like this. All right, we're gonna speed this up so it doesn't look so bad. Okay, now even if the stand was relatively straight, the best way to eyeball this is to put it on the ground and just see how laid back is that head tube angle. So at first glance, this is fairly steep. And if you're looking at something kind of straight up and down, this is more raked out than I like it to be. But because I don't have the bearings in here or the headset fully installed, this will move forward and back a good ½ degree or more. Now, with the set of bars on here, you can kind of see the difference in angle. This is going to be a little bit raked out, maybe a little bit more than I want to. And this right here is an 80mm fork. The way I can measure that, if it's not on the fork by itself, you can take a straight ruler or even a piece of cloth tape and measure the distance between the bottom of the crown here and the top of your tire. Now, oftentimes the actual distance is between the bridge, the lower part of the bridge here, and the upper part. And this is actually at 80mm. So, for the sake of this angle, I've tried this out a couple times already. You can put a bar on here to come and double check. It's a little more than I like, but it's not terrible. If I wanted to play it safer, a 60mm fork is what I'd go with. The trouble is, coming up with a 60mm fork in 2022 is a little tough. So, as far as the wheels go, as far as suspension, this I'm willing to try, but I may still go looking for a shorter traveled fork. So right here, you might be thinking, well, heck, where's the binder bolt? Where's the seat collar? And that's because this fits fairly snug. This is 27.2mm seat post, and it's actually designed for that. So one of the ways you check these things is by using a caliper. I'm sure if you don't have one yourself, you can go down to a bike shop and just borrow one, but if you check the inside diameter of your caliper, it'll show your measurement. And then when you go to purchase a seat collar, if you don't have one, you measure the outside. Something else to consider is the brake bosses on your bike. So something I like to do is check to make sure that this isn't so old that the cantilever posts are higher than they should be. There was a time in the early 90s, like 92 to 93, where caliper brakes definitely were not thinking of V-brakes. And so you might have a U-bolt or a U-style brake that was designed with cantilever posts that came up much higher in the frame. So today, if you were to try putting on V-brakes, there's no chance it would fit. And so simply putting some V-brakes on here first, lining them up with the rim just to make sure everything's going to fit is a really smart idea. And these are going to work just fine. Okay, just want to point out quickly again, this is our derailleur hanger that bolts onto this frame. It's fairly unique in that it's sandwiched the frame on both sides and has two machine bolts that go into here and threads all the way through. Some frames, especially steel frames, were welded into the frame itself, and you want to double check that your threads are still good and that it's not bent before you do anything like repaint it. These are the little things like cantilever posts, etc., that really can screw up a bike project. So I'd really encourage you to look at your threads on everything and make sure that everything's looking good before you proceed. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about briefly is your stops. A lot of frames, especially in the 90s, put all their cable stops at the top of the frame or on the bottom of the top tube. And this one here I can see has had a crash or something has nicked it pretty hard. And I want to make sure that the brake housing actually fits in there to run it back to the V-brakes. If you choose to run a single speed up front where you don't need a front derailleur, you still want to double check that you have the cable routing guides underneath the frame. Here you can see the threads in the bottom bracket, they're nice and clean. But here we have this little bolt, we're missing our cable guide. This is a plastic clamp that has a single bolt that allows the cables to come down and go through to the back rear derailleur. And if we were to use the front derailleur, it comes down and allows it to either swing around the front or the back to pull the front derailleur. So we're still going to have to source this from somewhere. Again, whether you decide to paint a frame or do something different with it, it's just really important to look across your entire frame to see if there are any major dents, dings, and possibly breakage on the frame. Steel frames are notorious for having small little breaks in the paint 25, 35 years after the bike came out. And that can be indicative of rust coming through in the frame. But even something rigid like this old Cannondale, under a large, heavy impact, you want to look around every welding surface to make sure there's no cracks or breaks within it. All right, so I feel pretty good about this frame where it's at before I send it off to have it sandblasted and repainted. I've checked all the brake stops, we've checked all the threaded surfaces. All I'm going to do now is just kind of clean it off so it's not so dirty and greasy for the person. And then I will leave some stainless steel bolts in every threaded surface so that the powder coating and things don't get into it. Okay, this is everybody's favorite part. Now, I'm actually going to replace the headset on this bike, so I'm not too worried about scratching this up. But it's still good to be careful you don't scratch the frame when you do this. You're lucky. Alrighty. Up next, we'll talk about parts and coming up with the drivetrain for this old bike. So this particular bike restoration is for my brother-in-law, who's been recuperating from a back surgery. He's not after the highest end components, but we certainly would like to get him some gearing and good enough brakes that he can go on the local trails with us and do some decent single track. So what we have here is a mix of old and new parts. We'll be doing a 9-speed drivetrain system with this old Icon 9-speed crank, a brand new sealed cartridge headset, and thanks to one of our sponsors, Mark Cycling, he'll get some nice sealed cartridge platform pedals and grips. We'll be doing a much wider handlebar and stem, and utilizing some older used parts here, including this old Shimano bottom bracket. The actual drivetrain is a 20-year-old set of LX and XT shifters and derailleurs. The Icon chainrings and Shimano cassette are actually in pretty good shape. So the only thing new we're adding to the drivetrain is cables, housing, and a 9-speed chain. So the total budget for this rebuild with paint is around $400. With all the used parts I had from other bikes, this definitely brought the price down lower, but by the time you buy a used fork, handlebars, stem, chain, small parts, tubes, it adds up pretty quickly. So something I would suggest doing is deciding how many new parts are really needed, and if you can find the used parts from somebody else. You'd be surprised how generous people are when they have a part lying around they're not using anymore. Thanks for watching this episode. I hope some of the tips and ideas we shared have been helpful. Please like and subscribe, and look forward to the actual build of this Cannondale mountain bike next week.